Let me welcome all of you this morning to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and particularly welcome this distinguished panel. We have had some good groups here, some high-powered groups, some very knowledgeable groups, but I think this one breaks the all-time record. We have for you today all living former USTRs. Rob Portman will be joining the group shortly from Cincinnati, with one exception. Bob Zellick, who felt that since he now runs an international organization, he couldn't come up here with all these chauvinistic American ex-government officials and speak from a U.S. perspective. But other than that, we have literally the entire scope of existing history of U.S. trade negotiations for today's program. It is a tribute to Sherman Katz that we have this program. Sherman joined the Institute last fall. He's a distinguished trade lawyer and practitioner. We're delighted to have him with us, not least because he brought with him this creation of his. This is the eighth annual session of the former USTRs, and with Sherman with us now at the Institute, we're hosting it here and proud to do so. I have one administrative announcement, and then I turn it over to Sherman. Susan Schwab, who will be speaking at lunch, is under unusually tight time constraints today. She'll be here at 1, and so I think we'll have her speak immediately when she comes, and then have some Q&A. If you could hold your stomachs until after that, then we can have a buffet lunch at our leisure after Susan has come and gone, but that will end the program and I think make maximum use of everybody's time. So, with no further ado, let me turn to Sherman Katz. Again, thank him for organizing today's program, and start the ball rolling. Sherman.
Thank you very much, Fred, and I want to again thank these USTRs. It's hard to believe we started former USTRs. We started this in 2001, and it seems to be almost guaranteed. You can plan your vacations on this basis. When we set a date for this, the weather is just usually lousy. So extra credit to all for being with us this morning. What I'm going to do is first mention very briefly who's on the panel with me, when they were USTR, what their current affiliations are. Then I'm going to offer a few administrative notes, and then we'll begin. And for those of you who haven't been here before, the format here is to have 6 30-minute sessions with each of our speakers on different topics. And each speaker will give 10 or 15 minutes to his or her presentation. Then before we open up to questions from the floor, we'll see whether the other former USTRs on the panel care to make any comments or have observations. As Fred said, we'll hope to wrap this all up by 1 o'clock when Susan will join us. And she's bringing some news. I know you'll be riveted in your seats anyhow, but I just want to tempt you by saying she's bringing some news about Doha. It's hard to believe, it's been promised before, but she has some news. Carla Hills was USTR from 1989 to 1993. She is the chairman and CEO of Hills and Company, and she'll be talking with us this morning about the Doha round. Clayton Yeutter was USTR from 1985 to 1988, and he is of counsel to Hogan and Hartson, and he will be talking with us as a former Secretary of Agriculture as well as USTR about this growing problem of trade and consumer protection and international regulatory cooperation. Charlene Barshefsky was USTR from 1997 to 2001. She is Senior International Partner at WilmerHale, and she'll be talking to us this morning about trade, national security, and Asian regional cooperation and bilateral cooperation. Mickey Kantor was USTR from 1993 to 1996. He is a partner at Mayer, Brown, Rowe, and Maw, and he will be talking to us this morning about the May 10 agreement regarding provisions in pending trade agreements. And when he joins us, Ambassador Rob Portman, who was USTR from 05 to 06, will be giving a different perspective on White House congressional cooperation. And Bill Brock, Senator Bill Brock, was USTR from 1981 to 1985, and he is chairman of the Brock Group. And as a former Secretary of Labor as well, he'll be talking to us this morning about trade adjustment assistance. A couple of extra notes. You may have noticed, those of you who haven't been with us before, that Bill Eberly is not on the podium. He has been with us for several years, given us excellent participation, and he couldn't join us this year, and we want to thank him in his absence for all his good years of enthusiastic participation. As Fred mentioned, we invited Bob Zellick, and he unfortunately said he could not join. So let's turn first to Carla's subject, the Doha round. As you know, as most of you would agree, we'd be pleasantly surprised if there were a significant, ambitious, as it's called, Doha round package. So far, that seems rather a distant possibility. Carla will talk to us about the status of the round. As you know, she did excellent work from '89 to '93, pulling together the Uruguay round, and so we hope she can give us some insights on how that might be done once again. And she'll also talk a little about future MTN rounds, should we have them, and the future of the WTO. And with that, can we begin?
Thank you, Sherm. Let me say that these reunions are great fun. It's wonderful to come back and be able to exchange thoughts with the former USTRs. And as Sherm said, he asked me to talk about the status of Doha. I will be mercifully brief, since you will hear from the real person who's close to it, Ambassador Schwab, in just an hour or two. I don't have to tell this knowledgeable group that Doha is in a precarious state. You know, it does, Sherm's mentioning of the Uruguay round, Doha reminds me of the Uruguay's bleakest days when John Crosby, a wonderful Canadian trade minister from Newfoundland, would say, well, she's dead, but she won't lie down. And so it is with Doha. We saw a welcome movement this past Friday where the chairman of the Agricultural Committee and the chairman of the Non-Agricultural Committee, NAMA, issued in a coordinated fashion revised comprehensive draft texts. And their aim is to move those two sets of negotiation forward so there can be cross-negotiation trade-offs, the so-called horizontal negotiations. And the differences that remain are many. They're down to 170 brackets in the agricultural text. In the negotiation, the members have yet to agree on acceptable levels of domestic support, size of tariff cuts, flexibility to deal with sensitive products, the extent of exemptions to be given to developing countries on so-called special products that are connected to rural development. And in the NAMA negotiation, some members warned that if the coefficient, and what I mean by coefficient is the highest possible tariff, were used in the revised text, the same coefficients were used as were used in the text of July 2007, they would find it difficult to impossible to enter any horizontal negotiations, while others gave the same warning if the coefficients were changed. So, and in addition, the members in the Doha negotiations are deadlocked over the extent that developing countries could exempt tariff lines from formula cuts. In the services negotiation, the gaps were so large that last Friday the chairman thought it unwise to issue a comprehensive text. The developed nations have proposed that all members agree to bind current levels of market access and national treatment and provide at least a smidgen of new market access, whereas, of course, the developing countries are refusing to do that. Yesterday, a 4-page text was issued, and it doesn't paste over the differences, but at least there's something to work from. It's been suggested, and I think that Ambassador Schwab is in favor of this, that there be an informal signaling, they call it signaling conference, at which the members might indicate what they would be willing to do with respect to services on an if and if basis, depending on what others do in agriculture. And yet it wouldn't be the same cross horizontal negotiation as between agriculture and the NAMA. The single undertaking which ensures that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed is offered as solace to those who insist on market openings in a long list of services, changes in rules, including changes in the dumping rules, movement of people, geographic designations. So when they say, if I don't get that, I don't play, they say, well, you don't have to make that decision now. Wait and see if there's enough good in the negotiations, because nothing is agreed until it's all agreed. The plan, as I understand it, is to give the members time to study the revised text, and now there are 3, one is very short, and consult with capitals before they return to Geneva to let their opinions be known, and before setting a date for a group of representative members to meet at the ministerial level, hopefully in March. Pascal Lamy has made it clear he would like to have a March or April meeting, and the question is, what's the reaction going to be to these texts? His press conference that covered the release of these 2 texts, he said, well, the text could be subject to further revision before we sit down and have the representative ministers meet in Geneva. And so at this point, one can say is that Doha has finally taken a step forward. It's a step that must be taken. Now, on speculating on the future of multilateral rounds of the WTO, I think we'd all agree that the failure of Doha would postpone any calls for a future multilateral round until the political climate changed dramatically. And I'm afraid it would demonstrate the members' weakened support for the WTO, that they just don't have the political will to put on the table something that makes the deal work. And I think both issues are extremely negative. Some have suggested it's not that great a loss, because the multilateral mechanism used to develop the WTO rules is flawed, it's slow, it's plagued with political inertia, it ends up at the lowest common denominator, and all of those things are true. But those are the same complaints that I hear about the democratic process right here at home today. Slow, inertia, and the lowest common denominator. With all of its flaws, it's still the best as compared to the alternatives, in my opinion. And at least it should be conducted in concert with alternatives. That is, we can have regional agreements. And no one would be happier than if we could strike a regional agreement with the APEC nations today. But I do think that to give up on the multilateral round has a cost. Others have suggested that the United States has higher priorities and they must give closer attention to Asia, Latin America, and the Muslim world. And they claim that when we're distracted by the multilateral round, we're less able to do that. That we have critical issues to deal with does not strike me as a reason to abandon the rounds. The question to me is not trade or our foreign policy. Colloquially put, I would say that this great nation ought to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And moreover, to be more serious about it, I think that opening global markets does offer the opportunity for a positive interaction on foreign policy issues, particularly Latin America and Asia and the Muslim world, and enables us to advance our foreign policy goals. Our early rounds opened global markets, stimulating growth that helped rebuild the economies that had been devastated after World War II. An agreement in Doha reducing the trade barriers that limit the commercial opportunity for developing nations would strengthen the economies and enlarge market opportunities for all the WTO members. Today, 3 billion people, half the world's population, live below the international poverty line. Currently, agricultural tariffs are 5 times higher than the tariffs on industrial products. And that disproportionately hurts the poorer countries in Latin America, Asia, and the Muslim world, which typically have large rural populations. And making matters worse, tariffs are much higher on goods like textiles, heavy glass, footwear, that are primarily produced by poor countries. You know, most Americans are astonished to learn that Bangladesh paid the United States $120 million more in tariffs last year on just $3.3 billion in goods than did France, that sold us $37 billion of goods. That works out to be a 15% tariff tax on Bangladesh and less than 1% tariff on France. It's also instructive to note that large developing countries that are members of the WTO, like Bangladesh, Indonesia, Pakistan, have substantial Muslim populations and are challenged by domestic instability. And each of these countries, has more than 100 million people living below the poverty line. So reducing global poverty by enlarging economic opportunities, in my view, is one of the most effective ways to strengthen our security. Impoverished states generally lack the ability to enforce their laws and secure their borders, making it much more difficult for our government to deal effectively with transnational problems like terrorism, organized crime, and narcotics trafficking. There's no one single policy to deal with the challenges that a great nation like ours confronts, but a bipartisan consensus supporting multilateral trade liberalization has contributed steadily and substantially to our prosperity and stability. And that bipartisan consensus is frayed in the face of polls showing that the American people are fearful about that opening international markets will hurt their economic prospects. I think to reverse that trend, government, business, think tanks, and universities are going to have to move on 3 fronts. And quickly, let me just tick them off. One is to provide basic information about the benefits of trade. Gary Huffbauer, a scholar here, has calculated that the United States is $1 trillion a year richer by reason of our open market policy over the past 60 years, and could be an additional $500 billion richer by reducing existing trade barriers. Most employee populations don't know that. A second is to help those who are displaced by globalization and technology get back on their feet. That means funding programs like wage insurance and health coverage tax credit to pay the premiums during transitional unemployment. The cost of both programs is a fraction of the gains that we derive from trade, and I think Bill's going to talk about that. A third is to invest in our future, to take steps now to ensure that the United States has the best trained and the most productive workforce in the world. That will require us to begin by improving education in the K through 12 levels. It's unacceptable that today 30% of our students in high school fail to graduate. And it will require us to encourage more study of advanced science and math. For years we've given tax incentives to invest in capital equipment. We've reached the point where today we must find incentives to encourage investment in human capital. And future rounds of trade talks give us a chance to continue to improve the rules that govern international commerce that will enhance global prosperity and security. But to have future rounds, we're going to have to change the political climate, and that'll take an effort by all of us. So I look forward to my colleagues' comments about how we're going to do it.
Thank you very much. Comments from the other former USTRs before we go for questions? Or questions?
I can just toss out one.
Can you be sure to hit the little button in front of you for the microphone?
There we go.
Thank you.
That would be, Carla, you mentioned the possibility of having a ministerial meeting in Geneva, maybe in March, on the Doha round. I wonder about the merits of having a ministerial meeting when the differences are still formidable indeed.
Clayton, it wasn't my idea, it was Pascal Lemie's idea, and I think he's thinking about 39 representative ministers meeting together. We've got now the G20, the G30, the G99, the defensive group G10, et cetera, to have representatives come together and to say what they can do quietly in whether it's the green room or whatever, probably is another step that needs to be taken. There's not much time left in 2008 unless they're able to strike a deal somewhere in the spring, and I suppose we could fudge it and say June is still spring. You're just not going to be able to wind it up. And so I don't oppose the meeting that would bring a small group of ministers representative of the groups. And this is very tough because the reaction in the G20 to the agricultural text is not homogeneous. Brazil wants the markets open. India doesn't. Argentina is fussing about so you don't have a harmony within the groups. So whether how you pick the representatives, I suppose that's how they got to 39, is just a big challenge. I hope there's enough on the table so people can say, look, we launched a development round. We're not going to be able to take home a big package of mercantile benefits. You know, it's our benefit. We're going to improve the trading system. If we can pull that off and remove some of the inequities, we will be advancing and polishing the global trading system, in my view.
One question, Carla. What role, if any, and how important would it be if played? Do Bush, Lula, Singh, Hu Jintao, Sarkozy, Merkel, Gordon Brown, etc., the leaders of the world play or not play in this? I have been concerned. There seems to be very little interaction on specifics and using political capital to get there on the Doha round among the leaders. Not I'm talking about the trade ministers, I'm talking about the actual leaders. What's your view of that?
Well, you always want more rather than less, and I think that the president has spoken out on open trade. President Sarkozy of France is a traditional French supporter of farm protections. But France doesn't have the portfolio for agricultural negotiations. That's with Pascal Lemie. And we will see next Tuesday, I think they are meeting, to determine just how far Europe is prepared to go in a harmonious fashion. Hu Jintao has, the complaints are clear. The Chinese believe that they have done all they're prepared to do when they did a lot in terms of the 2001 accession. I would argue with them that they are benefited by having the global markets expand by creating opportunity. And that since they've done so much, if they would agree, particularly in agriculture, to move the process forward, they would get a dividend. So they all could do more. I think Fred has.
Yes. Anybody else? Fred. Anybody else on the panel want to ask a question? I have one, but I'll hold it. Go ahead.
I want to put a question to Carla, but to all of the distinguished panel as well. I hope they'll respond to it in their remarks. What happens this year is important, and we should focus on that. But I think the big question is what the next U.S. administration decides to do in this area. So I'd like to ask Carla, but everybody else, what do you think the new administration should do coming into office next January? Assuming Doha is still further along, kind of moribund, hasn't been dramatically reinvigorated. Should they just scrap it and say, well, it was a good effort, but it didn't produce any results over 7 years, so we got to try something else? should they, to the contrary, take a big, major, new initiative to try to restore it and give new U.S. leadership to it? Put yourself in the position you've been in the past. You're the USTR, the new president a year from now. And as Nikki rightly said, the head of state's got to take a lead on this, take a view, make a decision. What would you propose?
There's no doubt what I would propose. I think that in the question of should, the ought category, that this nation should lead, and that we should and must improve the global trading system. It has inequities, it works against poor countries, and we will harvest that problem in very, very sad and unfortunate ways. What will happen, I cannot tell you. In every prior administration, the succeeding administration has carried out the negotiations that have been handed to them in the status in which they were handed. President Clinton finished the Uruguay round, and that was handed to him by President Bush, and it was not complete. And there were changes made. I won't take the time to go through them, but there were changes made. I worry because today politics are not driven by strategy, but are driven by polls. And we have taken a sharp turn in 2008 against a 60-year bipartisan consensus over economic integration, globalization, and open markets. It is shocking to me that in 1995, under President Clinton's leadership, we were celebrating the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and that we were launching a free trade area of the Americas, that we were supporting 21 nations in the Asia-Pacific region to open up their markets, 2010 by the developed countries, 2020 by the developing countries. This was under a Democratic administration. I listened to the debates closely. I look at the websites closely. Trade has become the thrashing point, maybe I should say trashing point, on the Democratic side. There is not one single candidate running from the beginning to the two that are in, who are supporting trade. It's a bad five-letter word. And quite frankly, the Republicans are ducking the issue, although Senator McCain has said he's for free and open trade, but he doesn't talk much about it. And that isn't because they suddenly came to an epiphany that trade was not, that open markets were not good, but rather they want to get elected. So we've got a big job to do to sell the American people of what the benefits are for trade. And the statistic that this institution has put out of what the benefits are ought to be circulated, and every CEO ought to be selling his employee population or her employee population as to what are the benefits that are derived from trade. Will that happen? I fear that trade will drop like a stone to the bottom of the agenda, and it will have adverse effects on our security, for the reasons I said, on our prosperity, and particularly damaging with a global slowdown.
Carla, here, let me follow that up with three possibilities for the multilateral trade agenda. One would be plurilateral deals, where you have, in a sense, those who are interested agreeing, as we did with the Information Technology Agreement, to make some special concessions to each other. Another might be service sector liberalization, where you would bring to the table not only trade ministers, but domestic regulators as well. And a third might be some form of mini-round, a less ambitious agenda. What would your view be on those possibilities?
None of those are mutually exclusive. All of them have an upside, but all of them have a downside. You could have a plurilateral agreement. Indeed, we had a regional agreement with the North American Free Trade Agreement as we negotiated Uruguay. In my opinion, the success of our negotiation, the signing of that agreement by President Bush, one, brought the multilateral folks back to the table because they were so fearful that we were going from the tip of Alaska, as the president had spoken, down to the tip of Argentina. And it looked like a great big Western Hemisphere trade preference. So I'm not against preferential plurilateral agreements. As to sectoral agreements, I'm not against those as a general proposition. The problem is if you take the low-hanging fruit with those that are necessary to give leadership to open up the market for the developing world, you are not going to get the same muscle or muscular support from the business community if they've gotten what they want from the major trading partners. What about Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, the Congo, the 6 countries that are the poorest, that are in the WTO? What about them? I think we have to, at the same time that we want to advance our economic advantages, which are mercantile in a sense, we have to also use trade as the carrot, as the sweetener, as the thing at the table that feeds all 151, now 152 with Ukraine. And so I want a lot of energy put into eliminating the inequities and the many rounds. If you have an open round, we have talked about having an APEC round where there would be liberalization. Those are rich and poor nations. And have it be open access, so that others could join if they would. That is another way to do it if you simply can't get the total multilateral round going. But I would not give up on it lightly. I think that we have more than the economic interest from opening those markets. There never was a poor country to which we gave access that did not sell us more and with a hard currency buy more from us. The pie grew, and it's absolutely demonstrable in the last 60 years, the last 10 years, wherever you look. So do all these things if you will, but for heaven's sakes push forward on the multilateral round.
Questions from the floor, and if you ask one, please come to the microphone, give us your name and your affiliation, and reminding all that we're working against the clock with Sue Schwab coming at 1 p.m. Ernie,
Ernie Preek, Manufacturers Alliance. The outset of Doha round, the U.S. position for NAMA, over 90% of merchandise trade, was multilateral free trade, perhaps with a 90% threshold. In other words, EU, APEC, Brazil, India. It didn't get very far at that stage, but in these 7 years we've had all these FTAs going forward rather quickly by the U.S., Europe, China. Even India is negotiating free trade agreements with the EU and ASEAN. So why not sort of a plan B after this experience, go to the WTO to negotiate a multilateral free trade agreement for sort of consolidating all the FTAs and going that extra step, APEC and EU, et cetera, for multilateral free trade, at least for non-agricultural trade.
I think that this spring the WTO is a little busy. And I certainly wouldn't try to start an initiative of weaving these agreements together at the WTO.
Next week.
As I've given the reasons repetitively of why I would like to push forward on having Doha succeed. If it fails, and it really is off the tracks, then weaving together the agreements is a good idea. Indeed, some of us have suggested that with respect to the free trade area of the Americas, that we open it up and have the same high standards that we have for the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Chilean Agreement with no exemptions and have open access. How many we would get is an interesting proposition. But we would like to add Colombia and Panama to that group, so that we tend to get a critical mass in Latin America. There's a lot of opposition to that. So, Ernie, I'm not saying that Plan B won't somehow be the only plan we've got. I'd sure like to put a big, big effort to Plan A to get this round done.
can take one more. Uri Dadush.
Yes, thank you. Uri Dadush of the World Bank. What do you say, I wonder, to those who claim that it doesn't really matter? Doha, the multilateral trade negotiations. We are seeing world trade booming 10% a year now for several years. Foreign direct investment is exploding. Last year, developing countries got $1 trillion of capital flows. So despite all the political rhetoric, the fact is that technology and own liberalization in a lot of countries is driving the system forward. What do you say to those who say, it's overplayed, we're making too much of it, let's not worry about it so much?
A lot of people are saying that, and I disagree. I think it matters a great deal. Your economic statistics are from a rearview mirror. Many economists today are very worried about global growth, and whether or not the United States, which has been the engine of growth, is now in a recession or will be, is a matter that economists debate. One reason to, and you can say that technology has driven some nations forward. Certainly you can make an order in a nanosecond, but there are many countries that don't have that technology, and they make their living off the soil. And if we continue to provide $7 billion worth of subsidies to our sugar farmers in the United States, Europe, and Japan, and forcing more efficient sugar farmers off of the lands where they make their living, and they do not have technology, you cannot really explain to them why they shouldn't listen to others that have values that are contrary to those of the West. Half the world's population lives in poverty. The Doha round is a development round. It is not only about economics. If we don't seize this opportunity, I think that we have hurt ourselves tremendously.